The morning sun had barely risen over the city, yet the air was already warm and heavy with the smell of exhaust and street food. The marketplace, still waking from its slumber, buzzed with the faint sounds of vendors rolling up their shutters and street sweepers clearing away yesterday's dust. In the corner of the market, under a faded blue tarp, Hannah stood quietly by her small wooden cart, arranging bright, ripe fruits into neat pyramids. Hannah was 8 months pregnant, her belly round and heavy beneath her simple cotton dress. The weight of her unborn child slowed her movements, but not her determination. She had been working as a vendor since she was 17, and though the work was hard, it was honest. The morning ritual was almost meditative for her. Wiping down the cart, polishing the apples and oranges, stacking bananas, and counting out the few coins she had left from the previous day. She needed to know exactly what she had before deciding how much she could afford to restock later that evening. Her days were long and exhausting. The sun would scorch her skin by noon, and the dust of the market would cling to her hair and clothes until she felt like she was carrying half the street home with her. Her swollen feet often ached so badly at night that she would cry silently in her small rented room, careful not to make any noise that would disturb the neighbors. But each morning, she wiped her tears, whispered a prayer, and went back to the market. What kept her going wasn't money. It was the tiny flutter of life inside her belly. When her husband passed away 2 years earlier in a tragic construction accident, Hannah thought her life had ended too. She had been just 23, newly married, and full of dreams of a small house and a happy family. His sudden death shattered everything. The little savings they had were quickly spent on funeral costs, and Hannah had no one to depend on. At first, grief consumed her. She spent weeks in a fog of pain, barely eating or speaking. But as the rent notices piled up and the landlord grew impatient, Hannah forced herself to act. She sold off what little jewelry she owned, bought an old fruit cart from a retiring vendor, and began setting up shop in the market. The first day she worked, she cried behind the cart after her first sale, both from exhaustion and from the bittersweet feeling of finally standing on her own 2 feet. Over time, she built a small but loyal group of customers. Some came for her sweet mangoes, others for her cheerful smile and kind words. She became known as the gentle vendor who always tucked an extra fruit into a child's bag if their mother looked tired, or who offered a small discount to the elderly. People often wondered why someone with such a generous heart had to struggle so much in life. Despite her hardships, Hannah kept her dignity. She dressed modestly but neatly, kept her cart spotless, and greeted every customer with warmth. Her inner strength was quiet but powerful, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic but endures through every storm. Pregnancy had added another layer of challenge to her life. The morning sickness in the first trimester was brutal. She often had to run behind the market stalls to be sick, then return with a smile as though nothing had happened. Now, in her 8th month, fatigue pressed on her like a heavy blanket. Simple tasks, lifting crates, bending to pick up dropped fruits, left her breathless. Her back ached constantly, and sometimes sharp cramps would force her to sit down for a few minutes until they passed. But closing early meant losing money, and losing money wasn't an option. Each night before sleeping, Hannah would place her hand on her belly and speak softly to the baby. "One more day, little one," she would whisper. "Mama is doing this for you. When you come into this world, you will not know hunger. I promise you that." Her rented room was tiny, barely big enough for a bed, a wooden stool, and a small cooking stove. But she kept it tidy and warm, decorating one corner with a hand-sewn blanket and a tiny baby shirt she had made herself. That corner was her hope, her dream of a future where her child could grow up safe, happy, and free from the struggles she faced daily. Hannah had also grown used to the stares of strangers. Some people pitied her, whispering about the poor pregnant widow selling fruits. Others looked down on her, as though poverty was a stain that made her less human. But she had learned to ignore them. Her worth wasn't determined by how others saw her. It was measured by her ability to survive, to keep going, and to love her child fiercely even before it was born. This morning was no different. The market slowly filled with life. Shopkeepers shouting prices, children running barefoot, customers haggling loudly. Hannah smiled as she handed a woman her change, her mind already calculating how many more sales she needed before noon to cover rent. She was tired, yes, but there was a quiet fire inside her that refused to go out. The sun climbed higher, making the sweat trickle down her neck, and the smell of roasted corn and fried snacks wafted through the air. Hannah adjusted her tarp to block the harshest rays and stood on her aching feet, ready for whatever the day would bring. What she didn't know was that today was not going to be like the others. The market, with all its chaos and noise, was about to become the stage for an event that would change the entire course of her life. The sun had climbed higher now, burning down on the crowded market. By mid-afternoon, the air had grown heavy with a mix of aromas, spices from the food stalls, smoke from grills, and the distinct smell of sweat and dust that seemed to linger on everything. Hannah wiped her brow with the corner of her shawl and stretched her aching back, letting out a soft sigh. Business was steady but not exceptional today. A few customers had stopped by, mostly regulars who knew she sold the freshest fruits. She'd managed to earn enough for the day's rent, which brought her a small sense of relief. But she still needed a little more to buy rice and vegetables for dinner, so she stayed at her stall even though her legs begged for rest. The marketplace was loud and chaotic as always. Hawkers called out to passers-by, bargaining voices overlapped one another, and the occasional horn from a motorcycle broke through the clamor. It was a familiar noise, almost comforting to Hannah by now. Yet, in that familiar chaos, something unusual caught her attention. Out of the corner of her eye, Hannah noticed a man walking down the narrow market lane. He stood out instantly, not just because he was well-dressed in a crisp suit and polished shoes, but because he seemed so out of place in this part of town. His clothes screamed wealth and power, yet his face looked pale and drawn, as though he had been walking for hours under the sun. Hannah's instincts told her something wasn't right. His steps were unsteady, almost staggering. He was clutching his chest with one hand while the other reached out as though trying to hold on to something invisible. Before Hannah could even call out to him, the man stumbled forward and collapsed, his body hitting the dusty ground with a dull thud. His briefcase fell from his hand, scattering papers across the dirt. For a brief moment, the entire market seemed to freeze. A few people stopped and stared, whispering to each other. Someone took out a phone, not to call for help, but to record the scene. Hannah's heart pounded as adrenaline surged through her. She didn't have the luxury to stand and watch. Every instinct inside her screamed that this man was in danger. Without thinking about her own condition, she hurried from behind her cart and knelt down beside him. Her knees pressed into the hot dirt, but she didn't notice. The man's face was drenched in sweat, his lips pale, and his breathing shallow. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. It was there, weak but still beating. "Help me!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Somebody call an ambulance." But no one moved. A few people shuffled uncomfortably. Some turned away, others kept filming. Hannah felt a wave of anger wash over her. How could they just watch? Didn't they see this man was dying? Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Hold on," she whispered to the stranger, even though he was barely conscious. "I'm not going to let you die here." She quickly scanned her surroundings, thinking fast. She had no car, no money for a taxi, and the hospital was a good 15 minutes away by vehicle. The man needed urgent help, and every second mattered. Just then, a motorcycle taxi stopped nearby to drop off a passenger. Hannah rushed toward the driver, almost stumbling as she ran. "Please," she begged, pointing to the man on the ground. "Help me take him to the hospital. He's dying." The driver hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the man in the suit. Perhaps he was worried about getting involved, but the desperation in Hannah's eyes must have convinced him. He nodded. Together, they lifted the unconscious man. No easy task for Hannah in her heavily pregnant state. Pain shot through her back as she strained to help, but she gritted her teeth and refused to stop. They managed to place him carefully on the motorcycle, with Hannah climbing up behind him to keep him from falling. The driver revved the engine, and they sped off through the busy streets. The wind whipped Hannah's face, carrying dust into her eyes, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. She kept one arm around the man's torso to hold him steady and used her free hand to keep his head from lolling dangerously. Her heart thudded with fear. Every time his breathing hitched, she felt a fresh stab of panic. "Just stay with me," she murmured over and over, as though her words alone could keep him alive. The ride felt endless, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. Every bump in the road made her wince, not just from the jolt to her body but from worry that it might harm the unconscious man or her unborn child. Finally, the hospital came into view, a squat white building that had never looked so much like salvation. The driver screeched to a stop at the entrance, and nurses rushed forward when they saw the limp figure on the motorcycle. "Heart attack," Hannah gasped. "He collapsed in the market. Please save him." The nurses quickly loaded him onto a stretcher and wheeled him into the emergency room. Hannah climbed down from the motorcycle, her legs shaking from both exertion and fear. She sank onto a bench outside the hospital entrance, her chest heaving. Sweat dripped down her temple, soaking into her dress. She realized she had left her cart unattended back at the market, but for once she didn't care about her livelihood or her few coins. Right now, all that mattered was whether that stranger would live. Hannah sat on the hard wooden bench outside the emergency room, her body trembling with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. Her hands were still dirty from the market dust, and her dress clung damply to her skin. The air outside the hospital was thick and hot, carrying the faint antiseptic smell that always seemed to cling to places where life and death were decided daily. Inside, behind those double doors, the man she had carried here fought for his life. Hannah's heart pounded as she stared at the no-entry sign on the door, willing it to open and deliver some news. Any news. Her back throbbed from the strain of lifting him. Her stomach was tight, her unborn baby kicking, as though sensing the stress coursing through her mother's body. She placed a hand over her belly and whispered softly, "It's okay, little one. We had to do this. Someone needed us today." The decision to act had been so instinctive that Hannah hadn't even had time to weigh the risks. She hadn't thought about leaving her fruit cart unattended in the busy market, where anyone could steal from it. She hadn't thought about the money she would lose by abandoning her day's sales. She hadn't even thought about the danger of climbing onto a speeding motorcycle at 8 months pregnant. All she had seen was a man on the ground, alone, dying, and she knew she couldn't walk away. Memories flashed through her mind as she waited. She thought about her late husband, lying in the hospital bed 2 years ago after his accident. She remembered clutching his hand, begging him to wake up, and the way her heart had shattered when the doctor came to tell her there was nothing more they could do. She remembered wishing, praying, for a miracle that never came. Maybe that memory was what had pushed her today. Maybe saving this man was her way of doing for someone else what no one could do for her husband. The minutes stretched into an hour. Nurses hurried in and out of the emergency ward, their faces focused and serious. Every time someone walked through those doors, Hannah straightened up, hoping they would tell her something. Finally, a doctor approached her. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a kind face. "Are you the one who brought him in?" he asked gently. Hannah nodded quickly, standing despite the protest in her legs. "Yes. How is he? Will he live?" The doctor's expression softened. "You saved his life," he said simply. "He was having a massive heart attack. If you had delayed even 10 minutes, he wouldn't have made it." Hannah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Relief flooded her body, so intense that her knees nearly gave out. She sat back down, her hands covering her face as tears streamed freely. The doctor gave her a reassuring nod before heading back inside. Hannah remained on the bench for a long time, crying silently. Not just out of relief, but out of sheer emotional exhaustion. She had been holding herself together for so long, fighting through every day for survival, and in this moment, it felt like the dam had finally broken. After a while, she wiped her face and straightened her back. There was no time to fall apart. She needed to return to her cart, check if her goods were still there, and salvage what was left of her day's income. But before leaving, she stood and walked toward the window near the emergency room. Through the glass, she saw the man lying on a hospital bed, hooked up to machines but breathing steadily. His face was still pale, but he was alive. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he had a family, if someone was on the way to see him, or if he would ever even know who had saved him. But none of that mattered. Hannah pressed her hand lightly against the glass, a gesture of silent farewell. "Live well," she whispered. "Make this second chance count." Then she turned and walked out of the hospital, her steps slow but steady. The motorcycle driver was waiting for her outside, leaning casually against his bike. "Madam," he said with a small smile, "you are very brave. Most people would not have bothered." Hannah gave him a tired but grateful nod. "Thank you for stopping. I couldn't have done it without you." He waved off her thanks, but there was respect in his eyes. "Go back carefully," he said. "You should rest. You're carrying 2 lives now, yours and your baby's." Hannah touched her belly again, feeling the baby kick softly as if to agree. "Yes," she murmured. "We'll rest soon." When she returned to the market, her cart was still there, though a few fruits had rolled onto the ground and been ruined. Surprisingly, no one had stolen anything. A kind neighbor from the next stall told her he had kept an eye on it. "You did a good thing today," the man said. "Not everyone would leave their work to save a stranger." Hannah smiled faintly, though her body was screaming for rest. "It wasn't a choice," she said simply. "If someone is dying, you don't think. You just act." That night, when she finally lay down on her narrow bed, Hannah felt a deep ache in every muscle. But she also felt something else, something rare and beautiful, a sense of quiet pride. She had faced a crisis and chosen compassion over fear, and she knew in her heart it had been the right decision. As she drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on her belly, she thought about the stranger in the hospital. Somewhere he was alive because she hadn't hesitated. She didn't know it yet, but this single act of courage would change the entire course of her life and her child's. The emergency ward smelled of antiseptic and urgency, a place where every second felt like it carried the weight of life and death. Hannah sat on a worn bench just outside the double doors, her back pressed against the cold wall. The rough wood beneath her felt like it was cutting into her skin, but she barely noticed. Inside, the man she had risked everything to bring here was fighting for his life. She could hear faint echoes of hurried voices, the metallic clatter of instruments, and the rhythmic beeping of machines. The sounds sent chills down her spine. Each beep reminded her of another hospital 2 years ago, another life slipping away. She closed her eyes, and memories surged up unbidden. She saw her husband lying on a bed, covered in white sheets, his breathing shallow. She saw herself gripping his hand, whispering desperate prayers into the sterile air. And she heard the doctor's voice, quiet but final, telling her that it was over. Her hand instinctively went to her pregnant belly. She felt a faint kick, as though her baby was reminding her of the present moment. "I'm here," she whispered softly, tears forming in her eyes. "I won't let you see what I saw that day. I won't let another person slip away if I can help it." Time seemed to slow. Each minute felt like an hour. Hannah's clothes were still damp from sweat, and her throat was dry, but she refused to move. A nurse walked past her carrying a tray of medicines, and Hannah caught her sleeve gently. "Please," Hannah said, her voice shaking. Is he going to be okay?" The nurse paused, her expression kind but non-committal. "They're doing everything they can. You should sit and rest. Stress isn't good for the baby." Hannah nodded weakly, her hand still protectively cradling her stomach. But she couldn't relax. Her mind was racing with thoughts. Who was he? Did he have a family? Was someone waiting for him at home, completely unaware that he was here, lying unconscious between life and death? An hour passed. Then 2. The sun outside had dipped lower, casting long orange shadows across the hospital floor. Hannah hadn't eaten since morning, but hunger was the last thing on her mind. Her entire being was focused on those double doors. Finally, they opened with a faint creak, and a doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes were calm. Hannah shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "How is he?" she asked breathlessly. The doctor gave her a small, tired smile. "He's stable now," he said. "It was a massive heart attack, but we were able to clear the blockage just in time. Another 10 minutes and he might not have made it. Whoever brought him here saved his life." Relief crashed over Hannah like a wave. Her knees buckled, and she had to grip the back of the bench to stay upright. She had been holding her breath for what felt like hours, and now tears streamed freely down her cheeks. The doctor continued gently, "You should go home and rest. He'll be moved to a private room soon. When he wakes up, I'm sure he'll want to thank you." Hannah nodded, though she wasn't sure if she would ever have the courage to face him. She had done what anyone with a heart would do. She didn't need thanks. Still, she couldn't bring herself to leave right away. She slowly made her way to the large observation window at the end of the hallway. Through the glass, she could see into the recovery area. The man lay there, connected to tubes and monitors, but his chest rose and fell steadily now. He looked peaceful, almost vulnerable. Without the power of his expensive suit or the briefcase he had dropped in the market, he looked just like any other human, fragile, mortal, and in need of someone's care. Hannah placed her palm gently against the glass. "You made it," she whispered. "Live well. I don't know who you are, but someone out there would have missed you. I hope they hold you tight when you go home." The moment was strangely cathartic. For the first time in a long while, Hannah felt a sense of control, as though she had taken fate into her own hands. She hadn't been able to save her husband, but today she had saved someone else. Eventually, fatigue forced her to leave. She thanked the nurses and walked out of the hospital into the cooling evening air. The world felt quieter now, softer somehow. The sky had turned a deep orange, streaked with purple, and a gentle breeze brushed her face as though nature itself was acknowledging what she had done. When she returned to the market, some vendors were closing up their stalls. Her own cart was still there, watched over by a kind neighbor who had seen her leave in a rush earlier. "You were gone a long time," he said curiously. "Everything okay?" Hannah smiled faintly, though her eyes were still red from crying. "Yes," she said softly. "Someone got a second chance at life today." That night, Hannah made herself a simple dinner of rice and boiled vegetables. She sat by the window of her small room, watching the stars come out one by one. Her back still ached from the strain of the day, but her heart felt light. When she finally lay down to sleep, she spoke to her unborn child again. "We did something good today," she whispered into the quiet. "One day, when you are old enough, I'll tell you about it. I'll tell you how we saved a man's life." As sleep pulled her under, Hannah had no idea that this moment of compassion would come back to her in ways she could never imagine. The man she had saved was not just any stranger. His survival would open doors she had never dared to dream about. The next day dawned quietly, but Hannah woke with a strange heaviness in her heart. The memory of the man in the hospital, pale and fighting for life, lingered in her mind. She didn't know his name, his story, or even whether he had regained consciousness by now. As she tied her shawl around her shoulders and prepared for another day at the market, she whispered to her unborn child, "We did something good yesterday, little one, but now we must work hard again. The world doesn't pause for heroes, does it?" She smiled sadly, packed her fruits, and made her way to the market. The air was cooler than usual, carrying the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. For a moment it felt like an ordinary morning. Hannah set up her cart, carefully arranging the apples, bananas, and mangoes into perfect piles. She swept away the dust that had gathered overnight and waited for the first customers. Slowly, the market came alive again. Children ran through the stalls, vendors shouted their prices, and the sounds of bargaining filled the air. Then, just before noon, something unusual happened. The usual rickshaws and motorcycles that crowded the street suddenly moved aside as if making way for something larger. The distant hum of engines grew louder, deeper, until a convoy of vehicles turned onto the narrow lane that led to the marketplace. Hannah looked up, frowning in confusion. 1, 2, 3, 8 gleaming black limousines rolled into view, moving in perfect unison like a fleet. Their polished surfaces reflected the sunlight so brightly that several people shielded their eyes. The marketplace fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children stopped playing. Vendors straightened from their stalls, craning their necks to see what was happening. The convoy came to a stop right in front of Hannah's small fruit cart. For a moment, all she could do was stare. 8 limousines, here, in the heart of a busy market where most people struggled to earn a few dollars a day, was a sight no one had ever seen. Hannah's heart thudded. A chill raced down her spine. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Was someone coming to accuse her of something? Was this about the man she had taken to the hospital? Her hands trembled as she instinctively placed them over her swollen belly, as if to shield her baby from whatever was coming. The first limousine's door opened with a soft, deliberate click. A man stepped out, tall, confident, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. He wore dark glasses and had an air of quiet authority, like someone used to being obeyed. Then, from the same car, another figure emerged, the man Hannah had saved. But he was not the pale, fragile figure from the hospital bed anymore. He looked strong, vibrant, and healthy, though there was still a hint of softness in his eyes. He wore a perfectly pressed suit that probably cost more than Hannah made in 6 months, and his hair was neatly styled. Gasps rose from the crowd as people recognized him. "It's Richard Lawson," someone whispered, almost reverently. "The billionaire, CEO of Lawson Enterprises." The name rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Everyone knew Lawson Enterprises. The company owned factories, real estate, and businesses all across the city. Hannah froze. She had no idea who this man was when she saved him, but now the reality of it hit her. She had saved a man whose name was printed in newspapers, a man who probably had enough money to buy the entire market 10 times over. Richard walked toward her with a calm, steady stride, ignoring the gawking onlookers. When he reached her cart, he stopped, smiled warmly, and said, "You must be Hannah." Hannah's mouth went dry. She nodded nervously, unsure of what to say. Richard's smile deepened. "You saved my life yesterday. You didn't hesitate, you didn't wait for someone else to act. You did something most people wouldn't do. You risked everything for a stranger." I just did what anyone would have done," Hannah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But Richard shook his head gently. "No," he said. "You did what very few people would do. You carried me to safety when everyone else just stood by. Because of you, I am alive today." He gestured toward the limousines. "And I don't take life for granted. I wanted to come here myself to thank you properly, and to make sure you know that your kindness will not go unnoticed." The crowd around them had grown larger, every vendor and passerby hanging on to each word. Some took out their phones to record the moment. Hannah felt every eye on her, and her cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She was just a poor fruit vendor, after all. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But I want you to come with me. There is something I would like to show you. Something that will change your life." Hannah hesitated, glancing nervously at her cart. I can't just leave my stall. This is my only way to earn money." Richard nodded once, then snapped his fingers. One of his assistants, a serious-looking man in a black suit, stepped forward and handed Hannah a wad of cash. "This should cover anything you might lose today," Richard said gently. "Please trust me. You saved me without asking for anything in return. Now let me do something for you." Hannah swallowed hard. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Slowly, she nodded. She handed her cart keys to the vendor next door, who promised to watch over it, and allowed Richard's assistant to guide her toward the limousine. As she slid into the plush leather seat, Hannah felt like she was stepping into another world. A world of wealth, power, and mystery. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, shutting out the noise of the market. Through the tinted window, she could see the crowd still staring, whispering among themselves, as the convoy slowly began to move. Hannah clutched her belly again, whispering to her unborn baby, "I don't know where this is taking us, little one, but I think I think our lives are about to change. And deep down, she knew she was right. The limousine glided smoothly through the city streets, its interior cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the hot, noisy market Hannah had just left behind. She sat stiffly on the leather seat, her hands clasped in her lap, unsure whether to feel nervous or grateful. The space around her smelled faintly of new leather and expensive cologne. The hum of the engine was soft, barely noticeable, as though even the car itself was too elegant to intrude on the moment. Hannah had never sat in such a vehicle before. She felt out of place, her simple dress and worn sandals a stark contrast to the polished perfection of her surroundings. Richard Lawson sat across from her, calm and collected. He watched her for a moment, his eyes kind but piercing, as though trying to read what she was feeling. "You look worried," he said gently, his voice carrying no judgment. Hannah forced a small smile, though her heart was still thundering in her chest. I don't understand why you're doing all this," she admitted honestly. "You're a very important man. You didn't have to come find me." Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's exactly why I had to," he said quietly. "Because yesterday, I nearly lost everything, and you were the only person who did something about it." Hannah looked down, almost embarrassed. "I didn't think," she murmured. I couldn't let you die there." Richard smiled faintly. "And that," he said, "is what makes what you did so extraordinary." The car slowed and turned down a long driveway lined with flowering trees. As it moved forward, Hannah caught sight of a sprawling mansion at the end, elegant, with high glass windows and perfectly trimmed hedges. Her mouth fell open slightly. She had never seen a house like this except in magazines. When the car came to a stop, a uniformed butler opened the door for her. Hannah hesitated for a moment before stepping out, clutching her shawl as though it might shield her from the opulence around her. Richard led her up the marble steps and into the house. The interior was breathtaking. Gleaming floors, chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars, and large paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum. Hannah felt suddenly very small. She was used to the noise and dust of the market, the smell of ripe fruit and sweat. This house felt like another world entirely, one she did not belong to. Richard seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't be afraid," he said gently, leading her to a sitting room where tall windows bathed the space in golden afternoon light. "You're here because you earned it." He gestured for her to sit on a plush sofa, and then he sat across from her. For a moment there was silence. Then Richard began to speak. "My name, as you've probably heard by now, is Richard Lawson," he said. "I'm the CEO of Lawson Enterprises. I employ over 10,000 people across the country. Yesterday, I was on my way to sign one of the biggest deals of my life, a deal that would have expanded our company and secured the future of all those employees. But I never made it. My heart failed me before I even reached the meeting." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "If you hadn't acted when you did," he continued, "I would have died right there on the street. My company would have been thrown into chaos. Thousands of people would have lost their jobs. My family would have lost me." Hannah listened silently, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. The weight of his words pressed on her chest. She hadn't thought about any of that when she carried him to the hospital. She had only thought about saving one life. But now she realized that one life was connected to so many others. "You didn't just save me, Hannah," Richard said softly. "You saved an entire company. You saved families. Children who depend on their parents' salaries to go to school. People who depend on me to pay their rent, their bills, their medical expenses. You gave me a chance to keep all of that going." Hannah's throat tightened, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered, but Richard shook his head firmly. "You did everything," he said. "Most people would have stood there, waiting for someone else to help. But you, a woman who is 8 months pregnant, exhausted from working all day, you risked your own health to save a stranger. That is rare. That is courage." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a key. "This," he said, handing it to her, is the key to a house. It's yours now. Fully furnished, fully paid for. You'll never have to worry about rent again. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A house? She stammered. Richard nodded. Yes, and that's not all. I've also set up a trust fund for your baby's education. They will be able to go to the best schools and never worry about money for their future. The tears that Hannah had been holding back finally spilled over. She pressed a hand to her belly, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. You don't have to do this, she said through her tears. I didn't save you for a reward. Richard smiled warmly. I know, he said. That's why I want to. Because people like you, selfless, brave people, deserve to know that their kindness matters. For a long moment, there was silence in the room except for Hannah's quiet sobs. Finally, Richard stood and offered his hand to her. Come, he said softly. Let me take you to see your new home. Hannah stood on unsteady legs, still in disbelief. As he led her back toward the car, she felt as though her life had been turned upside down in the span of an afternoon. Just yesterday, she had been a poor fruit vendor worried about making rent. Today, she was being handed a house, a future, and a chance to give her child a better life. And it was all because she had chosen to act when everyone else had chosen to look away. The limousine rolled to a smooth stop in a quiet neighborhood that felt like something out of a dream. The streets were lined with flowering jacaranda trees, their petals scattered across the ground like a soft, purple carpet. Neat rows of houses stood on either side, each with a tidy garden and a white picket fence. It was the kind of place Hannah had only ever admired from afar. A place she never thought she would be able to live in. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest as the butler stepped out and opened her door. She took a deep breath before stepping onto the driveway. The air here smelled different. Fresher, calmer. As though even the breeze knew this was a place where worries came to rest. Richard stepped out after her, his hands in his pockets, watching her closely. He wasn't smiling in the proud, self-congratulatory way that some wealthy people might when giving charity. No, there was quiet satisfaction on his face, like someone who had finally done something that truly mattered. Welcome home, Hannah, he said softly. She turned her head slowly, her gaze falling on the house in front of her. It was beautiful, 2 stories high with warm cream-colored walls, a red-tiled roof, and large windows that caught the afternoon sunlight. A small porch with wooden chairs overlooked a well-kept lawn where pink roses bloomed, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Richard replied gently. Just know that you deserve this. Hannah pressed a hand against her belly, feeling the faint kick of her baby. She could hardly believe that her child would be born into a place like this, into comfort, safety, and dignity. Upstairs, she found 2 bedrooms, each beautifully furnished. One had been turned into a nursery, with soft pastel walls and a crib waiting by the window. A small rocking chair sat nearby, as though inviting her to sit and sing lullabies to her baby. Hannah's tears finally spilled over. She sank into the rocking chair and buried her face in her hands, sobbing softly. Richard stood in the doorway, giving her a moment. You've worked hard your entire life, Hannah, he said after a pause. You've fought to survive every single day, even while carrying this child. Now it's time for you to rest a little, to breathe, to have a home where you and your baby can feel safe. Hannah wiped her tears, looking up at him. But why me? She asked brokenly. There are so many people out there struggling. Why did you choose me? Richard stepped into the room, his voice quiet but firm. Because you didn't wait for someone else to help me. You didn't think about the risk or the cost or whether I could repay you. You just acted. That kind of heart, it's rare. And when I see it, I believe it deserves to be rewarded. Hannah swallowed hard, still overwhelmed. And that's not all, Richard added, reaching into his pocket again. This time, he handed her a thick envelope. Inside was a set of papers, legal documents, but also something that made her gasp. A business license and a small card with the name of a shop printed on it, Hannah's Fresh Market. It's yours, Richard explained. A fully stocked fruit and vegetable shop, right near this neighborhood. You've been selling produce on the streets for years. Now you'll have your own store. A safe place to work where you won't have to stand in the heat all day. Customers will come to you." Hannah clutched the papers to her chest, unable to stop the tears. I can't believe this," she said hoarsely. "I never dreamed." "Then start dreaming bigger," Richard said with a smile. "You've earned it." For the next hour, Hannah explored every corner of her new home. Every room seemed to whisper a promise of peace, of safety, of a better future. When she finally returned downstairs, she found Richard waiting by the door. He gave her a final nod, his expression warm. "You're not just a vendor anymore, Hannah," he said softly. "You're a business owner, a homeowner, and soon you'll be a mother. The world is yours now. Take care of it." With that, he turned and left, giving her the space to take in her new reality. Hannah stood in the living room long after the limousine had driven away, listening to the silence of the house. For the first time in her life, the silence didn't feel lonely. Felt like peace. She sank onto the couch, both hands cradling her belly, and whispered to her baby, "We're home." 6 months later, the quiet little neighborhood had grown used to the sight of a young woman with a warm smile standing proudly in front of a small but beautifully kept shop. The sign above the door read, "Hannah's Fresh Market," in cheerful green letters, and the smell of ripe fruits and fresh vegetables filled the air around it. Inside, the shelves were always neatly arranged. Baskets of apples, oranges, tomatoes, and herbs displayed like artwork. Customers often commented that Hannah had a special touch. Everything looked fresher in her store, and she always greeted each person as though they were the most important customer she'd ever had. Her pregnancy had been smooth, thanks to regular doctor visits that Richard had arranged. And just 2 weeks ago, Hannah had given birth to a healthy baby boy, Elijah. Now, as she stood behind the counter, she wore him in a soft wrap across her chest, the baby sleeping soundly while she worked. Her life had completely changed. She no longer woke up at dawn to push a rickety cart across the city streets. She no longer worried about rain ruining her produce or police shooing her away from sidewalks. Instead, she opened the door to her own shop each morning, brewed herself a cup of tea, and welcomed her neighbors with a genuine smile. But today felt different. Today, she had a feeling something or someone special was coming. Sure enough, around noon, a sleek black limousine pulled up outside the store. Hannah's heart leapt as she recognized it instantly. She hurried to the door just as Richard stepped out, dressed in his usual elegant but understated suit. This time, though, his face wasn't pale with illness or lined with worry. He looked relaxed, healthy, and was that pride in his eyes? "Mr. Richard," Hannah said joyfully, rushing forward to greet him. He smiled warmly. "I told you to call me Richard," he reminded gently. "Yes, Richard," she said, blushing. "It's so good to see you again." He stepped into the shop, looking around with quiet admiration. "You've done well, Hannah. Very well." Hannah's eyes shone with pride. "Thanks to you. You gave me the chance to start fresh." Richard shook his head. "I gave you a tool, Hannah. You're the one who turned it into something beautiful." Customers who had been shopping nearby began to whisper to each other, recognizing Richard as one of the city's wealthiest and most respected businessmen. But Hannah ignored the curious glances, leading him to a small table at the back of the shop. She poured him a glass of fresh juice and set it in front of him, then unwrapped Elijah gently and placed him in Richard's arms. "This is Elijah," she said softly, "the little boy you helped bring into a better world." Richard looked down at the baby, his usually stern face softening. He rocked Elijah slightly, smiling as the baby stirred and stretched. "You know," Richard said after a pause, "when I was lying there on the pavement that day, I thought my life was over, and in a way it was the life I had before. Everything changed because of you, Hannah. You saved me, and in doing so, you reminded me what really matters. Not board meetings, not wealth, people, human connection." Hannah's throat tightened. "And you saved me," she said quietly. "I don't think I'd have made it through the last few months if it wasn't for your help." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching customers come and go. A few children ran in laughing, their hands full of coins, eager to buy sweet bananas from Miss Hannah. Richard finally stood, carefully handing Elijah back to her. "I have one more gift for you," he said. Hannah's eyes widened. "Richard, you've already given me more than I ever dreamed." "This isn't charity," he interrupted gently. "This is partnership." He handed her a folder. Inside was a proposal, an offer to expand Hannah's Fresh Market into 3 more locations across the city, fully funded by Richard's company. "You'll be the owner and face of the brand," he explained. "You'll employ other women like you, single mothers, street vendors, people who just need a chance. We'll give them training, good wages, and safe places to work. Your story can inspire a movement, Hannah. Are you ready for that?" Hannah stared at the papers, her heart racing. She imagined dozens of women standing behind their own counters, no longer hungry or desperate, no longer afraid for their children's futures. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'm ready." Richard smiled, a deep, satisfied smile. "Then let's change this city together." As the limousine pulled away later, Hannah stood in the doorway of her shop, Elijah in her arms. The afternoon sun bathed them in golden light, and for the first time, she felt not just grateful but powerful. Her story had started as that of a struggling, pregnant street vendor. It had taken a turn when she chose compassion over fear. And now, she was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, a mother, a businesswoman, and a symbol of hope for everyone who believed that kindness could still change the world. She looked down at her sleeping baby and whispered, "We're going to build something beautiful, my love. For you, for us, for everyone." The bell over the shop door jingled as a new customer walked in, and Hannah smiled, ready to greet them. Life had finally come full circle, and this was just the beginning.